Good afternoon, everyone. To start, I would like to thank the Association of Political Science Students for organizing this colloquium and providing an opportunity for me to present my research. I would also like to thank Dr. Jansen and Dr. Belanger for all their support and guidance while doing this study. My presentation is titled Aboriginal Nationalism or Canadian Citizenship, a theoretical analysis of Aboriginal voter participation. I became interested in the topic of Aboriginal voter participation when I noticed a gap in the literature while studying voter behavior. There are copious amounts of research on the voter participation of recent immigrants, women, and youth. By comparison, there are only a handful of articles which explore the voter behavior of Aboriginals. Before presenting my research, it is important to cover a couple key background points regarding Aboriginal voting. First, Aboriginal voting is a relatively recent development. It wasn't until 1960, under the Diefenbaker government, that Aboriginal people received the federal franchise, and it was 1969 before the last province extended the right. Before this point, enfranchisement was a tool of assimilation, and Aboriginals were required to meet strict conditions to be able to participate. Second, various research has shown that voter participation rates have declined overall. However, the available research shows Aboriginal participation rates have fallen at a greater rate than the rest of the Canadian population. The exception to this trend is the participation in band elections, which research has shown remains fairly high. With this background in mind, the question I asked in my research is, can this low voter turnout be explained through theoretical models of voter participation? In my research, I looked at 3 traditional models of voter participation and 2 models specific to the Aboriginal population, with the assumption that each theory would provide a slightly different explanation for the factors which either encourage or discourage voter participation. The first traditional theoretical model I looked at was the rational choice model. This model is based on a cost-benefit analysis where a person will vote if the benefits outweigh the costs. The voter is required to estimate the expected benefits and costs of voter participation. The second model was the resource model of voter participation, which states that people require access to 3 resources to be able to participate: time, money, and civic skills. A person with access to more of these resources is more likely to participate in the electoral process. The final traditional model is the mobilization model, which suggests that people will vote when facing pressure from various actors within their social network. These mobilizing actors can include politicians, non-governmental organizations, interest groups, family, and friends. Adding to the traditional models of voter participation, I also identified from various sources 2 possible theories specific to Aboriginal voters. The first of these is what I call the nationalism model. This model suggests that Aboriginals view voting in a Canadian election as equivalent to voting in a foreign system of governance. Proponents of this view believe voting compromises the Aboriginal sovereignty as espoused by the treaties, and as a continuation of the colonial system which oppresses and dispossesses Aboriginals. The second model is called the integrated citizenship model. The main premise of this model is that Aboriginal sovereignty is important, but participation in Canadian elections provides an Aboriginal voice in the process. Essentially, Aboriginal identity is not compromised by holding a Canadian identity. Proponents of this view believe voting Voting is a way to recognize the treaty partnership, have a say in both treaty relationship and who is involved in treaty negotiations. Each of the previous theoretical models have their own strengths and weaknesses when it comes to explaining voter participation. However, it is more important to look at the larger possible implications. Overall, the traditional theories of voter participation can provide a partial explanation for Aboriginal voter participation. However, they fail to account for the unique background and context of Aboriginal voters. The Aboriginal specific models can also provide a partial explanation for Aboriginal voter participation. However, they fail to account for the higher levels of turnout in band elections, as these elections tend to be run under the Indian Act, which is a foreign system of governance. The next question I asked in my research is, are these theoretical models apparent in the academic literature? It is important to note that since the expansion of the franchise in 1960, very little research has been conducted on Aboriginal voter participation. The existing academic research tends to focus on the rate of participation rather than the underlying causes for voting or not voting. Looking at the identified theoretical models of voter participation, I found that the general theories are rarely covered in the existing literature. When general theories are covered, discussion tends to fit the resource model, focusing on the lack of resources as a possible explanation for low turnout levels. The theories specific to Aboriginal participation are only implied within the existing literature. The literature tends to discuss whether or not a declining sense of Canadian identity plays a part in low turnout levels. This leads to a split between the nationalism and integrated citizenship models, with authors arguing for one side or the other. The next question to ask is, are these theoretical models in the news coverage of Aboriginal voters? In an attempt to isolate dominant frameworks for Aboriginal participation within the mainstream media discourse, I selected a sample of 10 newspaper articles dated between July 8th and October 16th, 2015, which covered the 2015 federal election. 4 of the articles came from large national newspapers, while the other 6 came from smaller local papers. While this is not a large sample, it helps provide a general idea of the discourse outside of academia. The dominant theme of all the articles analyzed was around the mobilization of Aboriginals in the upcoming election. However, there was a marked difference within the set, as the national news coverage focused on the Assembly of First Nations, while the local news coverage focused on grassroots movements. Other theoretical models identified include both the nationalism and integrated citizenship models. The nationalism model appeared almost exclusively in the national news coverage, while the integrated citizenship model appeared almost exclusively in the local coverage. So what does this all mean? The available literature has shown that Aboriginal voters participate at lower rates than other groups. While there is a lack of concentrated academic research, the bulk of what exists tend to revolve around Aboriginal sovereignty and the nationalism model. This is also true of the national media coverage. However, given the focus of the national media with the Assembly of First Nations, it might be argued that this view is concentrated at the elite level. The concern around all these conclusions is that the literature on Aboriginal voter participation is lacking in depth and needs to be expanded to provide a more complete picture of Aboriginal voter behavior. This is especially true of the empirical data. However, this empirical data will be difficult to obtain due to the small, dispersed population, lack of trust in academic research, and various communication barriers. Without fresh data, it is impossible to determine if nationalism can be found throughout the various Aboriginal groups, or if it is concentrated at the elite levels. If the nationalism discourse is concentrated at the elite levels, it will be important to determine which theoretical discourses are found to be important to the general Aboriginal population. So to summarize, further study is needed. To this end, there are a couple areas for further study. First, there needs to be further analysis into the nuances of the various theories of Aboriginal voter participation to determine the perspective of Aboriginal people. Second, more work needs to be done to determine the voter participation rates of urban Aboriginals and Métis voters. Finally, more research is needed to determine to what extent historical antecedents and cultural differences play in determining the voter participation rates of Aboriginals. Once again, I would like to thank everyone for taking the time to come and listen to the colloquium today, and I'd like to open the floor to questions now. was looking to see if the theories of Aboriginal voting are concentrated at the elite levels, whether it's nationalism is specifically at the elite levels or if it can be seen through the entire population. To see whether historical antecedents and cultural differences play a role in the voting differences. And I got this stumped. Oh. And research to determine the perspectives of Aboriginal voters.
So given the challenges that you outlined during the empirical research, how do you go about answering this question?
Well, it's difficult. The best way I've come up with, and we've talked about this in my undergrad thesis, is to use a survey method to get at the voters themselves and see if any of these ring true to the voters. Unfortunately, the difficulties remain in certain ethics considerations, having a proper sample size, having to go through band offices to get access to Aboriginals living on reserve. I think that's one of the main reasons that there hasn't been a lot of research on this, is because of the methodological difficulties in researching Aboriginal voters. Excuse me. Dr. Cyril?
It should have quite interesting, more comment than a question here. Certainly one theory that's out there is kind of relating to the system, and the people will tend to vote more if they've got candidates they can relate to or identify with as part of their group. One can think of the large spike in African American turnout in the 2 U.S. elections when Obama was on the ballot, which has since, of course, fallen off. So that would seem to imply where there are more First Nations candidates, or there's more First Nations issues in politics, and indeed perhaps there are just more First Nations people generally, that there'd be higher turnout. So I suspect on that there'd be much higher turnout, say in Nunavut, because that's pretty much the nature of the population. But of course the problem is, if you just look at Nunavut, all sorts of other things, the small population overall would factor in. It'd be hard to compare. But one thing might be comparable as well, situations where there is risen First Nations candidates on the ballots in certain constituencies, depending on what level you're looking at, or even the total population, which might mean that their issues become more central. I wonder, the question I suppose, whether First Nations turnout would be much higher in northern Manitoba or such places where they're such a big share of the local population than in an urban riding where they seem to get lost in the shuffle. And so that's something you could, at a macro level, look at, but of course it doesn't. It has a kind of methodological problem, is you're not confirming that it's actually First Nations voters are returning at higher, just the aggregate level, but if you had some sense that that might be something driving. So that might be a harder thing to do, but the first thing might be a possibility if we have races where there were First Nations candidates and there weren't. How much of an effect does that have?
The best thing I got on that is looking at the band elections. There's an argument that because you're within the same culture and the issues are a lot closer and it's the smaller population, that's why turnout in the band elections is so much higher. But the issue with looking at polling data, especially on reserve polling data, is that a lot of reserves, or some reserves, don't allow polling stations on reserve property, and some polling stations are part reserve, part non-reserve, so it becomes difficult looking closer at that level. But the band turnout numbers would suggest that that might be a factor.
Could you just repeat the nationalism model, please?
So the nationalism model is the idea that Aboriginal sovereignty is paramount when it comes to not participating in an election. The idea is that you're voting under a foreign system of governance, and this compromises your Aboriginal sovereignty. There's several scholars out there, such as Pam Palmater, Taiki Alfred, who would follow along these lines. Yes.
What did you say the other specific model was?
Would be the integrated citizenship model. And that one, they hold Aboriginal identity and a Canadian identity at the same time and see no problem voting in both systems. Yes.
Thank you, Shania, for for your presentation. My apologies to the first presenter, came in late. We're kind of a little late. Myself, I am Aboriginal from the West Coast, Treaty Indian, Civil Treaty 2007, and growing up in that environment, White Village Treaty finalized. The rights within that only pertain to members of that nation, and the voting under picking a party, right, running with it. It's always a tricky sort of, like, who am I going to support? Knowing the fact that it's a settler colonial state, again, giving up that identity to vote, so you vote someone in power, and then your rights are restricted, your freedoms are restricted. You have people in the news today, conservative prime members saying make fully Canadian, get rid of the reserve system, so another form of colonialism. And so you have other parties that support Aboriginal communities but aren't doing enough. So if that politics goes on and continues, you still live your life in your world, in your community, whether it's on off reserve, marginalized in the city, marginalized not being included in on reserve. So getting past the barrier is a tricky one because yes, those bad elections do go on.
Yeah.
Yes, there are large family members or large family in number to vote for that chief councillor in power. But those monies and that business only, again, no Canadian has any right to vote on or know what's going on because the money is already earmarked. Like, here's your money to run your government. Why look at the number when it's going to affect anyone else? So my question was, how do you understand, how do you deal with knowing it's a settler colonial state and nationalism can't really be achieved if the person doesn't believe in the country? How do you work around that sort of issue?
I'm not sure. Like I said, the research isn't there, and it's been really difficult to try to tease out these models out of what exists. I mean, I hope to go on and research this a little more and try to answer a lot of these questions, but right now I'm not sure how to answer that.
So now you said there was ethical concerns about researching Native groups on, like, at what level does that become a hurdle that you have to overcome, or something that could hinder your research?
At an undergrad level. I know I've started looking into it. I want to, for my undergrad thesis, I want to look at the voter behavior between Alberta Natives and my local band in Six Nations in Ontario. And I know in Ontario I actually have to go through my band office to get the ethical approval to do that. And I know I haven't read as much as I should, but the Tri-Council ethical statement requires that you have to follow certain guidelines for Aboriginal research, and it suggests that you should go through the band office before you do any research on reserve. And I think it might have to do with the idea that these are vulnerable populations, so you have to go through that extra hurdle.
Okay, thank you.